Professor Ed Stringham, let's give him a warm Pachyderm Club welcome.
All right, great. Thanks so much. It's really nice to be here. The media is overlooking certain things, but maybe not as much as you suggest, Carl. Yesterday, Carl brought me, I was on Fox Business yesterday, which was cool. And then 10 days ago, I was very surprised, but they didn't air the segment, but I got invited for the first time to be on CNN. So today I'm going to talk about some overlooked aspects of free enterprise and private enterprise that are making modern markets work, and discuss how, because they work behind the scenes, most people do not appreciate them, these entrepreneurial solutions, and most people attribute order to, I'll just call them bureaucrats to be polite to them, in Washington, D.C., instead of actually attributing order to private solutions that exist today. Some of the examples I'm going to give you come from my book, Private Governance, Creating Order in Social and Economic Life, published by Oxford University Press. And then I will give some more modern examples, specifically technological advances over the last couple of years associated with things like blockchain technology, Bitcoin technology, that mainstream financial institutions such as JP Morgan are using right now. After I give these few quick examples, I will end with a fable. All right, so I'm going to give you a few real stories, and then I will end with a fable. All right, first story. 2 years ago, on February 5th, 2016, some of you might have read about this, hackers posing as officials from the Bank of Bangladesh sent the Federal Reserve Bank of New York request to send $900 million to 2 private accounts, one in the Philippines and one in Sri Lanka. And so the Federal Bank of New York was like, okay, sure, no problem. And they start transferring this money. And this is a Friday, which apparently Bangladesh Friday is a weekend. And so nobody in Bangladesh was aware of this. And it took a routing bank, Deutsche Bank, to notice that the recipient was it was misspelled, Foundation. And the Deutsche Bank was like, Federal Reserve Bank of New York, I'm not really sure if this is a legitimate request. And they said, oh, okay, let's just put it on hold. But by that time, they had already transferred $100 million, and the money was withdrawn and spent on casino chips. Impossible to track down casino chips. So, I bring this up to mention to you, if these 2 large governmental institutions can't track down $100 million that's stolen from them, how do small businesses track down money that's stolen from them? I was selling some of these books, and I shipped a copy to Kazakhstan. And a couple weeks later, I got a chargeback on the credit card, MasterCard. It said it was a fraudulent order. It's a fraudulent order. And so what did I do? 911? I need you to get my $20 back, please. I called up the police in Kazakhstan. I called up a lawyer in Kazakhstan. I had my local lawyer initiate a trial in Kazakhstan, got on a flight, went there, was waiting around for 6 months. I couldn't really figure out how to establish the trial, but my lawyer assures me I'm going to get my $20 back. In online commerce, it opens up exchange vastly to everybody around the world, but it also opens up people to a lot of fraudulent orders. And it turns out that whether they like it or not, government officials don't have the ability to track down anonymous fraudsters. A survey of large corporations in London found that police will not investigate any online fraud of anything less than $200,000. All right, so even though laws against fraud exist, we can't rely on police and courts to track down quasi-anonymous fraudsters around the world. I knew a friend who had a computer business in the 1990s, and some hackers got into his machine, and they were basically going to ruin his business. So he didn't know what to do. He panicked. He called the police. The police did show up, and they looked around like, okay, what happened? Somebody broke into my computer, and the police looking around. Where'd they come in from? The guy's like, from the internet. And the policeman, this is the 1990s, goes, what's the internet? All right, so what actually happens? Part of what I document in this book is various private solutions that take place without us even knowing it. And the one I'm going to highlight for a minute is the example of PayPal. And the technology used by PayPal is now used by every single person's credit card in this room, your banks as well, but quite amazing. When PayPal first was invented in 1999, at the end of the year they had a few hundred users. By May, they had like 5 million users. I forget the exact amount, but something very crazy, exponential growth. And it turns out they were victims of tons and tons of fraudulent orders. They had no idea how sophisticated it would be. People would have these phishing scams, get passwords, and then transfer $10 from everybody's account in the middle of the night. And the same thing, like the example I gave you at the beginning, transfer the money out in the morning before anybody noticed. Many times people notice much later. This was costing PayPal millions of dollars per month, far in excess of their gross annual revenue. All right, so just think about that for a minute. You're losing per month more than your gross annual revenue. And so similar to my two other examples I shared a minute ago, they approached various law enforcement agencies and found that they were not equipped to help PayPal get their money back. And so what do? Private enterprise, private initiative. They took the matter into their own hands, and they basically programmed, they had humans as well, but relied on a series of artificial intelligence and with human review, where the system would analyze all transactions at any given time and say, all right, it is 5 a.m. on Saturday. George Pearson is making a transaction for $1,000. Well, you know what? George doesn't really usually make transactions at 5 a.m. And so basically assigning probabilities whether this is a real or a wrong transaction. And if it's fishy, requiring extra verification, freezing a transaction, freezing an account in many cases, and working behind the scenes to weigh the probabilities of whether they're going to turn down a good order or accept a bad order. All right, so what they did is they transformed what could have been a legal problem into a problem of risk management. And today, they brought the fraud loss ratio down to 0.5%. Okay, so some fraudulent orders get through, but not much. Same thing with your credit cards. Your credit cards are mining millions, in terms of analyzing millions of transactions per second and assigning probabilities whether they are good or not. The Business Week magazine described PayPal as a pre-crime detective. one of the founders of PayPal, Max Levchin, referred to PayPal as a security firm masquerading as a financial firm. Okay? So the better that companies are at solving problems like this, the more they can profit. And it turns out PayPal got purchased for $1.5 billion from eBay, and now it's actually worth more than eBay. Right? So by using entrepreneurial innovation to solve this problem, it has enabled online commerce to expand. I'll give you a couple other examples from my own life, and then we'll get into the blockchain-related examples. 20 years ago, I worked on a trading floor for a very large financial company. It was in World Trade Center, Boston, which was the largest trading floor outside of New York. And we were dealing with 5% of all New York Stock Exchange traded stocks, so it was a very large company. And I was on a specific desk called the over-the-counter trading desk. And that dealt with stocks which weren't listed on the New York Stock Exchange, in many cases stocks that became delisted. In these cases, we would have to call up. We'd look in what looked like a phone book. It's called the pink sheets. Figure out who would make a market in a specific stock. Call that person, get a quote, and then if we'd relay those quotes to the other brokers who wanted to make those trades. And then if they wanted to do it, we would have the trader make the order. Now, this was going on tons and tons of times per day, and it's very easy to mishear an order. Did you say buy 100 shares or sell 100 shares? Or what was the limit order? It's easy to make a mistake or fill the order at the wrong price. And it was our obligation to make sure the customer got what he or she ordered. It was our obligation. And so what would happen? Part of my job was to deal with these trades that went bad. And what would happen when a trade went bad? 911, go get those guys. Elizabeth Warren, go sue them. They gave me the wrong price. We're gonna start a trial. We're gonna start an investigation. It's gonna be great. It's gonna be only 6 months trial. Is that what I did? Guess what I did? You all know, I dealt with these people every single day, multiple times per day. Simply call them up. There was an error, we don't know who made it. If it was a small price error, simply, okay, fine, let's reverse the transaction at the wrong price, make the transaction at the right price. And that was the end of the story. Because it wasn't worth haggling over these small trades between both of us who are dealing with so many transactions every day. Just make sure the customer gets what the customer should have gotten. If the price of the stock had gone up a lot or down a lot, if it was a big problematic trade, we would then do an internal investigation between the two firms, see who was at fault, and in which case the party, in most cases the trader who made the error, would have to eat those losses. Okay? So no law was involved. It was just simply what Adam Smith, the first famous economist, is attributed to talking about. He didn't actually use this terminology, but I like the terminology called the discipline of continuous dealings. Markets have people interacting with each other so much every day that they can't go around defrauding their business customers or their business partners. So markets create incentives for cooperation. Even if the law says something or doesn't say something, people still want to cooperate. And Adam Smith was one of the first people to talk about this. You can't have an open trade, an open position, and go to trial. That's the last thing these two companies would want to do. Is like, okay, we've got to wait 6 months to figure out how this customer is going to get what he is owed. It's just not an option. Next example is from my cousins own a kitchen company, and they started out selling kitchens for residences, and they've expanded over time to selling kitchens for skyscrapers in Manhattan. And installing or having 200 or 400 kitchens is a much bigger proposition than installing one. And the master developer of any high-rise is dealing with tons of companies like this, not just the kitchen company, but the plumbing company, electricians, all the different people. And how do they know that each of the subcontractors is going to deliver on time? When you build a high-rise, it's a very complicated endeavor. I lived across the street from one, and I saw it built over basically the course of a year. They're adding like a story or two per week. It's unbelievable. They're out there at 7 a.m. every single day. And why do they do it so quickly? Why don't they just do it on a relaxed basis? Well, it's costly to have those cranes. It's also costly if you don't complete the deal on time. You need to recoup your investments. And each of the subcontractors is like a part in a marching army where logistically, if one of them holds up the show, they could hold up the show for every single other party after them. Like, oh, well, we need to install the kitchens, but we don't have the pipes yet. It just would be a huge disaster. So I'll ask the same question. What happens if somebody doesn't deliver? 911? Cops! Go get them. They're not installing the kitchens in time. You gotta force them to install the kitchens in time. Is there a legal regulatory solution? No, actually, there is a private solution, and it's called a performance bond or a contract bond. My cousin's company, they have to go to this other company, which is the equivalent of an insurer, that says if they don't deliver, we're going to cough up a ton of money to make sure that this project is not jeopardized. Now, why would this company be willing to take this risk? Well, first, they're getting paid to take the risk. But second, the incentives, the market incentives are aligned, so nobody wants to have a default on this performance bond. So they do an investigation ahead of time to see whether my cousin's kitchen company has the capacity to deliver 200 or 400 kitchens. They'll look at their past track records and say, oh, well, all right, you did one before, 50 kitchens. All right, we see you can do that. Now tell us how you can do 400. So you get the amount of writing underwritten based on your past performance. In the same way, you can't go into the bank willy-nilly out of the blue, having never met them, say, oh yeah, could I borrow $5 million? They're like, okay, wait, let's just start with a car loan. Can we do that? Can we agree on that? The result is my cousin's company, they're never going to want to default on that performance bond, because if they did, they'll never get underwritten again. So the market has created incentives for people to deliver what they owe, to deliver their contracts on a timely basis without having to rely on the law. All right, the next example I will give is also from New York, and I will then get into the fable. One of my friends works for the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation. Does anybody happen to know what that is? Does anyone have a business relationship with them? Does anyone own any stocks? Every single person right now has your stocks deposited with them. They have just tons and tons of every stock. It's $49 trillion worth of securities. They keep track of this. The two precursors to them, which merged, were created in the 60s and the 70s after what had developed was called a paper crisis on Wall Street. So up and through the 70s, even 80s, financial firms were wheeling back and forth, literally the equivalent of wheelbarrows, like full of tons and tons of certificates of paper. And as trading volume went up, there's just like so much paper. It's very difficult to keep track of it. And so they developed electronic clearing and electronic settlement. So a very important innovation. After that, for the first time, financial firms were able to leave New York City's financial district. So Midtown Manhattan or even New Jersey, you don't have to be physically taking these pieces of paper back and forth. Well, even though most of the certificates that we own, in this room own, are now in electronic form, there's still many, many certificates that are on paper. And as of 2012, it had 1.7 million paper certificates and millions of other documents stored in a 10,000 square foot vault 60 feet below street level at Water Street in Manhattan. Now, I was had a place in New York at the time, and in 2011 or 2012 rather, there was something called Hurricane Sandy, and it was coming right to New York. People were calling me saying like, are you gonna be okay? Well, also at this time, there was Occupy Wall Street movement a couple blocks away. So I was actually kind of rooting for Hurricane Sandy. I wanted the floodwaters to rise just enough. Turns out my place, the basement was flooded and it destroyed all the electrical equipment. With seawater, apparently once it touches any type of equipment, including wires, just destroys them. So all the elevators, all the electrical equipment was just ruined. So I had to move out. We didn't know if it was going to be like permanent, but the building was condemned for what turned out to be 2 months, and huge hassle. Now, Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation. Guess what happened to them? Let's check out our vault, 60 feet below street level. Open it up. 1.6 million certificates floating. So, a really amazing rescue mission. Basically, they got all of this under armed private security. They got these freeze trucks, and people would carry under recording and under armed guards all of the certificates up to street level, put them in these freeze trucks, freeze the certificates, which prevents deterioration. And then under private armed security, Brinks trucks drove all these certificates down to Texas. There, they freeze-dried the certificates, which for those scientists in the room, you can tell me how that somehow gets the water to disappear out of these documents. And then for those of you who are also into science, you can fill in the details of the chemical process that they then added to basically prevent these certificates from changing further. And then they drove all that back up to New York City under private armed security, and the problem was no longer. Now, guess what entity is investing in new technology associated with blockchain? Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation. So Bitcoin was invented by like crazy libertarian geeks, and I was always like, oh, that's cool, neat, whatever. But it turns out right now mainstream financial institutions are borrowing technology from Bitcoin for other uses. specifically the blockchain ledger technology. And so groups including NASDAQ, JP Morgan, Accenture, Chicago Mercantile Exchange, Deutsche Börse, Goldman Sachs, IBM are investing in blockchain technology. And I'll just tell you how it works here. With NASDAQ, they will have for certain private issues, a list of, here are the 100 shares in the company, who owns what. And that's basically a ledger that's distributed on many different computers. And so if the vault gets flooded, well, we've got this ledger distributed on many computers. Right now, even publicly traded firms don't know who owns stock in their company. They might know that Fidelity Investments customers own 1.3% of their stock, but they don't know that it's you. And so a blockchain ledger could actually keep track to say, okay, let's see, who owns 80% of the company? All right, great. You might find yourself someday where Anna Nicole Smith owns 10% of your company. I don't know if people got that joke. Okay, there's a certain large company around here where Anna Nicole Smith was going to own the shares, and people are like, really? So everything worked out fine. But blockchain technology can help people track to see who owns what. I'll give you another example, and then I can relate it to this with blockchain technology, and then I'll get to my fable. Another thing that firms are trying to do is use blockchain technology to facilitate faster settlement of trade. So in my book, I go through examples of the first stock markets in 17th century Amsterdam, 18th century England. You would have basically quarterly settlement. Stockbrokers would trade back and forth tons and tons of times, and then once per quarter, they'd settle all their trades. So it's basically they were doing the equivalent of a forward contract or a futures contract with quarterly settlement. Nowadays, most stock transactions are settled in 2 or 3 days, which is much better, but even that can cause problems. And I'll just give you an example. Imagine 5 banks or 5 broker-dealers trying to settle transactions, and let's assume there's no central clearinghouse for a second. If one of the 5 banks, say they're each giving each other $100 million or $100 million worth of something, if it takes one of them a little bit longer to settle that transaction, the one next to it will say, well, where's my money? And then the one next to it, well, where's my money? And it could cause this kind of chain reaction in the same way as the kitchen company in the skyrise. So what these firms are trying to do at this point is use blockchain technology to basically pre-reconcile trade ahead of time, and then once you know that each party has it, basically instantly settle it. So that's one of the promises of blockchain technology, is you have a list of all of the certificates of whatever there is, or in the case of Bitcoin, here's the 21 million Bitcoins in the world, and you know that I own this Bitcoin, and I just simply give you my keys to my safety deposit with my Bitcoin in it, transaction settled, quasi-instantly. So this is very important for many firms. Another example related to this that a lot of firms got worried about, nervous about a few years ago, was these contingent contracts, such as a credit default swap, which is basically insurance on a loan. If the loan goes bad, the equivalent of the insurer, the writer of the credit default swap, such as AIG, says, well, I'll pay for that. Well, that's fine if not too many of these things are defaulting and AIG's in a good situation. It's no problem at all. The market works great. But a couple of years back, a few years ago, 10 years ago, AIG, lots of people are showing up to its door and say, can you start paying for this? And a lot of people, it was almost like this rush to the bank. And AIG lost its AAA credit rating. And that also in these contracts said, if you ever lose your AAA credit rating, you got to come up with a lot more collateral. And people were worried, how are they going to do this? So firms that went through this are keenly interested in blockchain technology, where they can actually say, all right, here's this collateral. It's held in escrow on blockchain-like technology. Now, it's not Bitcoin, but it's using that style technology distributed among different banks. The last example of this, which I think is very cool, there's something called a smart contract, algorithmically enforced smart contract, where you program a bunch of computers, distributed computers, to look whether the conditions of a contract are met or not, and if they are, have the contract executed. And this is done privately. The simplest example of a smart contract is your soda machine, the soda machine downstairs is programmed, if $1 goes in it, then release the soda. It's enforced by a machine. Smart contracts can also be programmed to say, if we have a bet on a sporting match, we don't need to, at the end of the day, call up a bookie and like threaten to break each other's legs. Smart contract says, at the end of the Super Bowl, visit NFL.com. The computer does this. At the end of the day, it goes to NFL.com, and then it says, all right, what were the terms of the bet? And then, all right, transfer $100 from me to you. Done. We don't need to rely on the courts. It's done by a computer. Now, I know what a lot of you are thinking. You're saying, okay, Stringham, you've given me a lot of really neat entrepreneurial solutions that exist in markets in modern times, in history. But aren't these private solutions? Isn't private enterprise ultimately dependent on government? Government really, I think they are the driving force behind blockchain technology. I think that's how it really worked. And they must have been the driving force behind contract bonds. And they must have been the driving force between all these other things. So now let me tell you a fable. This is partly based on truth. So my family is from upstate New York, and my dad, when he was a kid, lived on this family estate, which I know around here doesn't sound like a lot, but it was hundreds of acres, 90 miles from New York City. So kind of amazing. It was very attractive. They used to produce grain and other things, but by the 20th century, we weren't doing that, or maybe middle of the 20th century, we weren't doing that anymore. And so this water, which used to have a mill, had become fallow. So you could go swimming in it. It was like a small pond or lake, whatever. But the only downside was this. It had leeches. So my dad told me once he went swimming, wasn't paying too much attention, decides to take a nap, wakes up a few hours later. Now, imagine these leeches can talk. Dr. Stringham, please don't get rid of us. You need us. We are here to make this great estate possible. We were here before you. We've commissioned studies. All great estates have leeches. There's a high correlation with the beauty of an estate and whether there's leeches or not. Now, We will not be greedy. We will not suck all of your blood. Just 21%. That's it. Now, in the interest of having my work open to interpretation, I will leave it to you, the audience, to decide whether this analogy applies to any real-world human institution. In each, let me conclude and I'll open up for questions. Each of the examples I gave, we have private entrepreneurial for-profit solutions existing alongside government, but doing the things that we assume were solved by the law, solved by the regulators, solved by police and courts, but they're doing it behind the scenes, usually for profit. In my book, I have other examples of the Dutch stock market, where people relied on reciprocity for hundreds of years. Government officials did not understand advanced transactions. They thought they were forms of gambling. And so private parties relied on reputation mechanisms, reciprocity, discipline of continuous dealings. This is a picture of the London Stock Exchange. Stockbrokers were kicked out of the Royal Exchange, and so they had to conduct business in informal environments, in coffee houses. They changed Jonathan's Coffee House into a private club where they would write a defaulter's name on a blackboard. This is the real first blockchain. They eventually turned the London stock, the coffee house, into what was called the stock subscription room, then to the stock exchange, and they eventually adopted as their motto, "My word is my bond." New York City, same thing. Tontine Tavern and Coffee House had rules about trading, not defaulting. If somebody defaulted on their contract, they'd be kicked out, and the only way you could get back in is if you made good on all of your defaults. And if they found that you had intentionally defaulted, you were kicked out forever. Okay, so these are private rules and regulations. The markets in 17th century were not created, here's a true story, by the 17th century Elizabeth Warrens of the world. We could attribute all order in modern day society to Dodd and Frank and all of their bureaucrats who make our lives so great, or we could recognize that it's not because of government, but it's because of private rules and regulations that make markets work. Thank you.
Okay, we'll start with questions. John, Mike is.
So, if the private market works so well, I'm come from the private market, so I understand what you're saying. What happens with Bernie Madoff? What happens there?
Chapter 9. Actually, I do talk about that. It's a very interesting and cool solution that already does exist and existed before Madoff, and it was called third-party custodian and accounting services. The vast majority of hedge funds before this scandal had this. So a hedge fund manager can execute the trades, make the trades, decide what the fund is doing at any given time, but does not have the keys to actually physically withdraw the cash out of this third party, like it could be Morgan Stanley or whatever, right? And Madoff did not have that. He had his accountant was his boyhood friend. He had one accountant, and he didn't have statements for people of what was in their account. So I feel bad for the victims of Madoff, but at least Madoff had the decency to deceive and defraud his investors rather than other entities which take 33% of my income for the rest of my life. A friend of mine worked in the third-party custodian and accounting service industry, and he said, well, you know, we were actually kind of happy after this Madoff thing happened because it was like a big I told you so moment. And now at this point, almost every single hedge fund has this third party.
Can I just follow up?
Yeah.
So how do you know, if you're dealing with a hedge fund, how do you know if they have that private solution or their rogue or whatever?
Yeah, so there's like, in many cases, 3 sets of books being produced at any given time. The hedge fund's doing it, the third-party custodian's doing it, and then there's the auditors are gonna check up on this as well. So I would just say, reputation. I'm going to trust Morgan Stanley's not going to abscond with my money, whereas, Madoff, it's a tricky case because he had 2 parts of his business. One part of it was legitimate. It was just a market maker. Actually, my firm used to deal with his firm, and as far as I know, that part of his firm was totally legitimate. And then separately had this big Ponzi scheme. But it was a $65 billion fraud, but $50 billion were recovered. So at the end of the day, that's $15 billion lost, which as far as I know is a little bit less than the $300 billion in increases in government spending announced this week.
Might I ask your insight or advice regarding private monitoring services such as LifeLock or others of the same nature?
Private monitoring? I'm not sure I know the example. Can you elaborate on it?
Credit monitoring services like LifeLock, one that comes to
Identity theft.
Oh, yeah. To me, that's a big issue because part of the downside with technology is it can be used for a lot of good, but also a lot of bad. And what was it, Equifax, that got hacked and shared all this information accidentally? I think that it's a big problem. And right now, I think Equifax is a huge disaster. And there's a lot of problematic things going on right now, but I don't know the solutions.
We have about 10 minutes left. And one question that I'll personally ask you, what are your views on the incoming new chairman of the Fed? Can you tell us anything about insights?
Yeah, so a lot of people say that Powell has very similar views on money and monetary policy than Yellen. And so a lot of people say, it's a little bit disappointing. With the president during his campaign he was even mentioning things like gold, which I think is really cool. But in terms of this guy, it's going to be probably a lot more of the same in terms of monetary policy. However, one thing that was told to me, which I think is probably right, is the big area where he diverges with Yellen is he is not such a huge advocate of regulation. So I was on a tour of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York a couple years ago, and in grad school I was always told, okay, Federal Reserve's, according to them, their job is to fight inflation and keep employment stable, the economy stable. And then when I was in this tour, they had those 2 things, and they're like, and to regulate banks. And I was like, weird. Where did that come from? They just kind of added this third mandate to themselves. And who debated that? Who decided that? Well, if that is what they're doing right now, which is one of their major things, and Powell is less of a zealous regulator, like that's going to be potentially big. I would argue that one of the main reasons why markets have been doing so well over the past year is the government has just put the brakes on this overzealous regulations. Basically, they had their foot on the neck of American businesses, and just taking that off a lot, it's like, wow, businesses can do things again? And then say, the government, we saved you.
Isn't it true that every defensive security system can be violated? What man makes, women make, can be broken. Just time.
That is definitely true. Sad, but true state of the world. Banks with the biggest vaults, sometimes those can be broken into, and the question is, how much are we going to spend on that, and what are the risks? Everything entails risks. A lot of these blockchain-related ventures that I mentioned associated with large banks, I think, are very reliable, but there's a lot of other ones out there which I'll just say they're fly-by-night organizations or poorly thought out. In one case, there was going to be this mutual fund which without any employees, and it was all going to be decided based on this like voting system of shares, and it just didn't, it was interesting, but it didn't make any sense. And so some clever like tricksters figured out how the voting system worked, and they're like, okay, great, we're going to transfer $100 million to me, and everybody else in this mutual fund, if you want to call it that, it was called the DAO, they're like, wait a minute, that's not what we signed up for. And then the people like, oh, right, yeah, we said there was not going to be a human oversight, but now there really is human oversight. So they reversed that transaction. So, you know, there's always going to be these problems, and I guess the way we should think about it is a game of cat and mouse, where fraudsters have gotten so much more sophisticated over the years, but at the same time, companies are needing to invest more and more and more into private computer security.
We've got time for 2 more quick questions.
All right, great.
Yeah, my name's John Faulkner, and I watched a documentary called The Inside Job by Charles Ferguson. Are you familiar with that documentary? About the 2008 financial crisis.
I've seen the trailer of it, and based on my non-informed view, I think there's, so I'm not commenting on this one, but there's a lot of other ones out there, which I'll just call them, well, let me have you ask your question, then I'll respond. Go ahead.
Well, you mentioned intentional default, and it would appear from this documentary that there were a lot of Wall Street companies involved in intentional default, and it was like a conduit.
Yeah, so that was my sense of what this documentary does. Another one that does this is called The Big Short by Michael Lewis. And my general position is these things get very close to conspiracy theories, which I think are wrong. So in The Big Short, they're basically this. The bankers were buying a lot of these securities so their firms could get rich and then go bankrupt. And I'm like, wait, why do they want to invest in something that they know is going to blow up and then their firm is going to blow up? Like, it does, to me, doesn't make a lot of sense. The people who are highlighted in The Big Short who are short selling right now are long on mortgage-backed securities. So just because there's a price fluctuation, it doesn't mean people know it's going to go down and it's like this big conspiracy theory. I reject that. And that's also in here too.
Thank you for your presentation. A quick question on the Federal Reserve. Which chairman, if any, in the past do you think did the right thing because it could be used politically or as it was meant to set up to be used? And I personally thought Paul Volcker was probably the last person that did what was necessary, despite it being, shall I say, something that a politician wouldn't really want.
Thank you. My favorite chairman of the Federal Reserve was the one when we had in 1900, which was none. Alan Greenspan, before he became chairman, was big advocate of private money and gold, and he said, this is real sound money. The institute that I am president of, American Institute for Economic Research, was founded in 1933 by E.C. Harwood because he was worried about government causing fluctuations in the economy by getting involved with monetary markets. And he was right. He said this in the 20s and the 30s. He was right. And so I think that the ideal is to move back in that direction and not give so much discretion to basically an unelected bureaucrat who can cause tremendous problems, perhaps even the last economic fluctuation, and then say, oh, did I cause that? I'm sorry.
You think our last director actually caused problems more than she thought?
To the extent she was complicit with a lot of the increases in regulations, I would say that was tremendously bad, yeah. But the fact that maybe we're easing off of that, I think that does have room for optimism, that we can portray markets as kind of or society as a race between the bureaucrats and the private innovators, and I think over the long run, the innovators will win. Thank you very much.
Thank Professor Edward Stringham. Thank you. Excellent.